Well, hello, everybody. If you made it this far, then you know that what I want to do today is to present the lesson kind of in a backwards way. I really wanted to get to the meat of the lesson, which was about lesson planning and rubrics. So let's build it backwards then. Okay? So we would start the lesson with me really telling you that what I want you to do is to understand that you really have to design a lesson when you're planning a lesson from the end. You have to design it with the assessment in mind. What do you want your students to be able to do at the end of this lesson, at the end of this class, at the end of this chapter? All that means is that you have to think about what you're aiming for, which is fairly obvious, but it's not always something that we think about. A lot of the times we think about, we start planning our lessons and we say, this is what I'm going to do now, and this is what I'm going to do next. But that's really not the way to do it. The best way to do it is to think about what you want the students to learn and then go the other direction. One group of professors calls this backwards by design, or understanding by design. A couple fellows by the name of Grant and Wiggins, and they have this whole curriculum and this whole textbook. In fact, you could take an entire course on backwards planning, which is really what this is about. It's about thinking of the outcomes and then how are you going to get to those outcomes. Okay? So, what I hope that you recognize is that planning this lesson is fundamentally, you have to start from the back. And then, as you plan it, you have to measure your progress toward those goals. How are the students doing? And this is called assessment. So you're measuring what the students are doing every single minute, sometimes every single, bit of time, every 10-minute period, every half hour, every hour. You're trying to figure out what your students are learning and how you're getting there. So obviously, what I want you to be able to do is to find the Alaska Content and Cultural Standards. You're going to design a rubric for me based on an assessment that you've gotten more familiar with. Okay, so that's where we're at. Okay, so let me make sure that I've got this timed right. So I'm trying to trying to work this out so that it makes sense to everybody. Let's start with what a curriculum is. Okay, so the definition of curriculum is that it is literally a course of study. So it's really the lessons that the teacher designs to present content for the students to learn. So it's how the lessons go together. It's what how each lesson is made. And the curriculum has to be that plan, essentially, that the teacher is going to follow. Typically, I think of curriculum as being kind of a semester long range. So it's what you're going to teach in this particular range. It can include the text. The curriculum includes the textbooks that you use, the videos that you watch, the tests that you give, the objectives that you have, the extra reading that you do. Did I already say the videos you watch? Those are the sorts of things that curriculum would involve. Now, what it really needs to make sure that it does is that it fulfills the requirements of the school or of the state or the district where you work. So you have to make sure that the curriculum fulfills those needs. It has to be organized. It also has to be, it has to include the measure of its success. Now, here in Fairbanks, I'm not sure how it is in every district. Some districts buy their curriculum wholesale, but in Fairbanks, the school teachers come together and they write the curriculum. So they'll write the biology curriculum so that every biology teacher in the district follows along the same sort of learning outcome, so that evolution is taught, at the same time of year that for everybody in the district. That evolution is taught with a certain number of units or objectives and goals. That mitosis and meiosis are covered. And so they decide what to cover and what could be covered in a particular semester or, the whole school year. So that's how they do it in Fairbanks. Other school districts are going to buy their curriculum. It comes in a big book with all the resources, the links to different online activities and videos and so on and so forth. And you could pay a lot of money for that. So just a different means, the different ways the school districts go about doing this. Now, because of the nature of the new standards that have been written nationally, and what we're talking about here are the Common Core state standards. So the Common Core state standards were written about 10 years ago, and states were invited to adopt these standards. So some of the states said, yep, we'll adopt these standards. Others said, you know what, I don't think we're going to adopt these. We'll design our own standards. Turns out that most of the states that did design their own standards, and Alaska is one of them, Alaska said, we're going to design our own standards, but you know what? In the end, they looked really, really similar to the Common Core state standards. But they did it because that way they can control, or they have that control, they can say they have that control of what the students are covering. But in reality, the need for national standards is pretty relevant and pretty realistic. I think that we need to have standards across the nation so that we can compare California school districts to Texas schools, to Alaska schools, to Massachusetts and Maine. I think that needs to be done. And so that's the step in the right direction, at least with some common standards. Now, having said that, the larger textbook companies are looking to the kinds of standards that California and Texas and New York have adopted. You know why? Because they have such large populations, they're going to buy lots of textbooks. So it turns out that the textbooks that you buy are really driven by what these more populous states are teaching. So if you want the latest and greatest biology text, 10 to 1, it's going to have the same outcomes and the same expectations that the state of California has adopted, or the state of Texas has adopted, or some influential ones like Massachusetts and New York. So that's just something to be aware of, that you can't write your curriculum, you can't take your book and use that for curriculum. Most of the time, you need to write your curriculum and then find a textbook that works for you. Otherwise, you're just going to be adopting someone else's curriculum. So typically, what your curriculum includes is not only the range of things that students are going to be doing, but what they ought to know, especially what they ought to know at a certain grade level. Now, here's what the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2014 said. It said every state has to develop this curricula, and the curricula has to have high standards. And as an example, here's some high standards, the Common Core state standards. So yes, the states had to develop these curricula, and yes, they could use the Common Core state standards, and many adopted not to, but adopted standards that look really similar to these. Okay, so standards-based education is pretty much what it sounds like. It's not a grade. Instead of being a graded sort of system, if you were strictly standards-based, your students would be measured on whether or not they met a particular learning outcome. And it wouldn't have to be, I guess, it's just that you have to get over this threshold. So it's not an A, B, C, D sort of arrangement. It's either yes or no. And if the students haven't met those outcomes, then they shouldn't, or are usually not, allowed to progress until they have. So that's what a real live standards-based education would look like. Now, very few school districts and very few schools across our country have really adopted such a strict standards-based education. Instead, it's kind of somewhere in between. It's really, these standards are there, and we hope that our students meet these standards, but sometimes they don't. And if they don't, but they still know enough of the information they need to progress on through school, then the students are passed along. So whether or not you agree with this is debatable. It's, it's something to be said and to be thought about, but realizing that if you set particularly high standards, many of your students or some of your students aren't going to progress forward, and then you're going to start having a backlog of students. So I think the realistic situation is you have to use the system, the cards with which you're dealt, essentially, and you have to work within that system. And I think that's what teachers are doing all the time. They're taking what they're given, they're looking at the students they have in their classroom, and they're making the best outcome they can for these students. Okay? Generally, we talk about content standards and performance standards. So content standards are what they sound like. They're what you need to know. Okay, so students should know, and that's commonly how they're written. You might also call them learning objectives. The different professional organizations around the country that are organized towards specific subject area content end up being the ones that write these content standards. For instance, the NCTM, which is the National Council for Teachers of Mathematics, really helped write the Common Core State Standards for mathematics. They're the ones that wrote the outline, the ones that organized the standards, what was going to be taught in what grades, why this would be taught first and this would be taught second, and all that sorts of things. So these professional organizations made up of professors of education, of teachers of education, of teachers of the particular content all across the country come together to write these. We have these professional organizations in just about every subject that you could think of, in addition to math, science, history, English, arts, all of that. Okay? So those are the content standards. Contrast that with performance standards, which are things that students should be able to do. So for instance, a student should know the multiplication tables. Okay, so that would be a content standard. What should students be able to do? Well, students should be able to correctly multiply two-digit numbers and get it right, 99% of the time. So that would be a performance standard. And if the student isn't achieving the performance standard, then you can go back and say, well, the student didn't learn the content. Okay? So I wanted to show you, because you need this for the lesson plan that you're going to do, you need to know where the content standards are for the state of Alaska. And the easiest way to do this is simply to literally Google, Alaska State Standards. And if you Google Alaska State Standards, you'll probably end up on this page. So this is the page that you'd land on. And here are all the state standards. So the standards in languages, mathematics, geography, cultural standards. So for your assignment this week, you're going to have to write an Alaska-specific lesson plan dealing with something Alaskan, and you're going to need a content standard in your area, and a cultural standard. So I want you to dig into these cultural standards here, in addition to the content standard that you hope to teach, intend to teach, want to teach. Okay? So these content standards are organized by grade. The cultural standards are organized by more by topic than by grade. And they're right here in this cultural standards PDF. And I'm just going to briefly show you this. So this is the one that you'd land on. And what I mean by topic is they're written for students and for teachers and for curriculum and schools. Okay? So those are the Alaska content standards, cultural standards rather, and I want you to look through those and see if you can't find one that would work for the lesson you're teaching in this student category. Your cultural standard B3 or C2, or find one that works for you. Okay? The content standards are more arranged by grade and subject. So you'll see here at history, we have the different history content standards, and then we come down here and we see the performance standards by grade level. Okay? Okay, enough of that. Let's move on with our topic lesson.